In the shadow of medieval Europe, survival was never guaranteed. Fields could fail, rivers flood, and barns stand empty, while law, custom, and the unseen forces of nature shaped every meal. From the acorns scattered beneath oak trees to the salted fish hauled from distant coasts, people devised countless ways to endure. Some relied on cunning, others on faith, and some on the fragile mercy of neighbors or kings. Markets teetered between salvation and disaster. Monasteries offered both charity and control, and the hearth became a battlefield where ingenuity determined life or death. Step into this world of hunger, risk, and resilience, where every loaf, every root, and every act of survival carries a story waiting to be discovered. In the medieval world, survival was dictated by the rhythm of the fields, where the agricultural calendar governed both labor and livelihood. The open field system that dominated much of Western and Northern Europe divided land into large communal strips, organized most often around a three-field rotation. One portion of land carried winter crops such as wheat or rye. Another portion was planted with spring crops like barley, oats, or legumes, and the final section was left fallow to recover fertility. This arrangement required cooperation across the entire village, because one farmer's neglected strip could invite weeds and pests into the plots of his neighbors, threatening the community's food supply. The system balanced soil exhaustion against the demands of subsistence, and that balance was fragile. Winter wheat provided the staple for bread, but if it failed, households had to rely on barley or oats, which were less filling and less profitable. Spring barley supported the brewing of ale, a beverage that provided calories and was safer than water. But if the barley crop withered, drink diminished as well as food. The calendar of agricultural life was marked by religious festivals. Lammas, on the 1st of August, celebrated the bread baked from the first harvest of wheat, and by Michaelmas, on the 29th of September, the cycle turned again to sowing for the winter crop. The weeks between Lammas and Michaelmas were critical, for the harvested grain had to be gathered, threshed, dried, and stored, while still leaving seed for the next sowing. A few days of rain at the wrong moment could prevent proper drying, leading to mold or rot in the granaries, and even a minor loss could tip the balance between sufficiency and hunger. The obligations of the manor economy made survival even less certain. Peasants were required to work on their lord's domain fields, often several days each week, in addition to tending their own strips. They owed rents in money or produce, and they were required to contribute tithes to the parish church, commonly 1/10 of their yield. The tithe barn absorbed this share before families could secure their own food, and in years when harvests were lean, that tenth might mean the difference between survival and deprivation. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries show repeated complaints from tenants about the burden of labor dues, but the system remained consistent because it supported the manor's structure. The process of plowing required both manpower and animal strength. In Northern Europe's heavy clay soils, only a wheeled plow drawn by a full team of 8 oxen could cut deep enough to prepare the furrows. Few households could maintain such a team independently, so villagers pooled their oxen, further binding their prospects together. If disease struck the animals in spring, plowing slowed, and the narrow sowing season could be missed entirely. A missed season reduced the following year's harvest, making recovery difficult without outside assistance. The vulnerability of this system appears often in local records. A wet spring could wash away seed, while a drought could prevent germination. Rye was prone to ergot fungus, which poisoned those who ate contaminated bread. Hay shortages were another recurring danger, as livestock relied on stored fodder to survive the winter. In Elton, Huntingdonshire, 13th century manorial records note disputes over meadow rights, since insufficient hay meant cattle and oxen died, which in turn reduced the capacity for plowing and manure spreading the next season. A failure in hay could therefore lead indirectly to weaker grain harvests the following year. Once the crops were gathered, threshing and winnowing became decisive steps. Sheaves left damp spoiled quickly, and a spoiled stack endangered an entire household's reserves. Barns were the most valuable buildings on the manor, and theft from them was treated with severity. In 1279, a Cambridgeshire court recorded a tenant fined for stealing sheaves from a neighbor's store. Such incidents reflected how precarious survival was, since the loss of even a small share of grain could push a family into dependence or hunger. The agricultural year followed the church calendar. Candlemas marked preparations for spring sowing. Rogation days brought processions and blessings over the fields, while Lammas and Michaelmas framed the harvest season. These observances gave rhythm to the year, yet prayers and festivals could not shield the fields from the threat of rain, frost, or blight, a reminder that the success of one harvest would always rest in the hands of the weather to come. In the year 1315, the weather across much of northern Europe turned against the people who depended upon the land for survival. The summer was marked by unrelenting rains that waterlogged the fields and made harvesting nearly impossible. Wheat, barley, and rye, which should have ripened in the warmth of late summer, remained green and sodden. Granaries that were meant to be filled with dried grain instead stood nearly empty, and by autumn it was clear that the harvest had failed. This was the beginning of what chroniclers later called the Great Famine, a disaster that stretched from 1315 to 1317 and claimed countless lives. The cycle of failure began with the skies themselves. Records from England, France, and the Low Countries consistently describe rain that fell without respite, turning furrows into rivulets and meadows into shallow lakes. In many regions, carts sank into mud so deep that the movement of grain became impossible even where some had been salvaged. Wet straw rotted in barns, and firewood, also soaked by the endless rains, could not be properly dried. Without fuel, ovens lay cold, and what little bread there was could not be baked easily. The wet years carried their consequences into winter. Livestock that might have survived on stored hay often starved, as the hay harvest itself had been ruined by the sodden summer. Cattle perished in barns, leaving both meat and milk in short supply, and their manure, essential for fertilizing fields, was lost. Oxen, the indispensable beasts of plow, died in great numbers, leaving fields unplowed when the brief sowing windows arrived. The chain reaction of shortages hay leading to livestock loss leading to weaker plowing teams, created a cycle that deepened the famine with every passing season. By 1316, the crisis had spread from the countryside into towns. Markets that once bustled with surplus grain saw stalls stand empty. The price of bread rose steeply. In England, records show wheat prices doubling and even tripling within months, while in France, officials tried to fix maximum bread prices through edicts that were impossible to enforce when bakers had no flour to use. In Bruges, chroniclers recorded desperate crowds gathering outside bakeries, only to disperse empty-handed when ovens failed to produce loaves. Blight and disease compounded the misery. Ergot fungus thrived in the damp conditions, infecting rye and causing illness in those who consumed it. Grain that might once have been stored for months quickly spoiled, and peasants who attempted to eat what remained sometimes suffered hallucinations, convulsions, or death. In some villages, whole families were stricken, leaving fields untended, and further reducing the possibility of recovery the following year. Locusts, though not as common in northern Europe, were reported in southern regions during the same period, adding yet another threat to fragile supplies. War, too, played its part, for the ongoing conflicts between England and Scotland disrupted already strained trade routes. Armies moved through the countryside, requisitioning what little food remained, leaving local populations stripped of their resources. Chroniclers in Scotland wrote of villages abandoned as families fled south in search of relief, only to find English shires suffering their own shortages. The granaries of monasteries and lords, normally symbols of stability, were no guarantee against hunger. Many were emptied by the demands of military campaigns or by the need to sustain urban populations. In Flanders, city authorities tried to import grain from the Baltic through Hanseatic merchants, but storms on the North Sea delayed shipments and left ports waiting in vain. The movement of food across regions was always vulnerable to weather, and in the years of famine, such vulnerability became starkly visible. By the close of 1316, hunger was widespread. Court records from Essex describe thefts of sheaves and animals, cases brought against men and women who took food simply to survive. In France, parish registers record increased burials, particularly among children and the elderly. Chroniclers spoke of people reduced to eating roots, nettles, or bark in an attempt to fill their stomachs. By 1317, when the rains finally began to ease, whole communities had already been diminished, and recovery was slow. The Great Famine demonstrated with terrible clarity how dependent medieval society was on the balance of weather and land. A single year of rain was disastrous, but 2 years together created a calamity that reshaped the lives of millions. For those who endured it, the memory of hunger lingered long after the skies cleared, a warning that even the greatest granaries and lords' barns were powerless when the weather itself turned against them. The granary stood at the center of medieval food security. More than a simple barn of timber and thatch, it was a symbol of authority and survival. Within its walls, hundreds of bushels of wheat, rye, or barley could be stacked in ordered rows, each measured and recorded by the bailiff. These stores meant the difference between endurance and collapse, but they were also the instrument by which lords maintained control over their dependents. Whoever commanded the grain commanded the fate of the community. On most manors, the harvest was divided before it ever reached a family's table. Tenants owed customary grain dues to their lord, a portion of what they reaped from their strips in the open fields. Sheaves were gathered into carts and brought to the manor barn, where clerks or reeves entered them into inventory. The procedure was precise: bushels measured, tallies kept on wax tablets, and disputes resolved in the manor court. A tenant accused of concealing or withholding grain could be fined heavily or even subjected to corporal punishment, for withholding a portion of the harvest threatened not only a lord's income, but also the supply system of the entire estate. Alongside these obligations stood the tithe. A tenth of every household's produce went to the parish church, stored in the tithe barn under the eye of the rector or his appointed officers. For poor families, the requirement could be devastating, especially in lean years when their own stores were scarcely sufficient. To surrender grain before one's children were fed forced a choice between hunger and disobedience, yet the church's claim was rarely relaxed. The combined weight of lordly dues and ecclesiastical tithes ensured that grain moved upward in society before it ever met the needs of the village itself. The great barns of lords and monasteries were more than private storehouses. They were strategic reserves for lean years, intended in principle to stabilize local supply. In practice, they were often directed by politics, military necessity, or the pursuit of profit. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, officials in England and France requisitioned grain directly from manor barns to supply armies and urban centers. Villagers watched carts roll away with grain they had grown, sometimes accompanied by soldiers to prevent protest, while their own households faced empty bins. Receipts were issued for these seizures, but repayment was uncertain, and bitterness lingered long afterward. Resistance occasionally took the form of concealment. Reports from Normandy describe villagers digging secret storage pits to hide sacks of grain from royal officials. Others transported grain by night, hoping to avoid confiscation. When discovered, such evasion was punished harshly, for it challenged both lordly authority and the logistics of kingdoms at war. Even outside famine years, barns were frequent sites of conflict. Court records from Cambridgeshire in the 13th century describe tenants accused of breaking into granaries or stealing sheaves from stacks. Punishments were severe, fines equal to weeks of wages or corporal penalties for larger thefts. These cases reveal how highly grain was valued. To steal even a small quantity was to endanger the delicate balance of supply upon which the whole village depended. Granaries also faced constant threats from within. Damp grain could sprout or rot, reducing whole stacks to useless mulch. Rodents gnawed through sacks, and insects infested stores that were not regularly turned. Some estates employed specific workers tasked with managing these risks, ensuring that the grain remained edible through winter. When such precautions failed, a lord might attempt to purchase grain from neighboring estates, but in years of widespread scarcity, such sources quickly disappeared. Preservation was as critical as production. At times, Barns became sites of negotiation. Lords could release grain to tenants as loans, recorded carefully in manorial account rolls. Borrowers pledged repayment after the next harvest, sometimes in kind, sometimes in labor. For many families, such loans meant survival, though failure to repay could result in the loss of land or increased service obligations. Grain was therefore both food and currency, its circulation enforcing hierarchy as much as it sustained life. The image of a bailiff counting sheaves while villagers stood waiting captures the double nature of the barn. It was a place of protection, yet also of coercion. The rhythm of its doors opening or closing determined who endured the winter and who was left to hunger, linking the fortunes of the village not only to their own labor, but also to the rights they could claim beyond the manor's walls. In the medieval countryside, survival did not depend only on the fields assigned to tenants. Much of the difference between subsistence and starvation came from the margins, where custom allowed villagers to make use of resources not strictly their own. The law of the commons, rights of gleaning, and access to the woods created a fragile safety net that supported the poorest households when harvests were thin. These customs were not charity but recognized obligations, written into manorial practice, and confirmed in charters that reached back to the 12th and 13th centuries. Gleaning was one of the most widespread of these rights. After the main harvest was gathered, villagers who did not have sufficient strips of their own were permitted to collect the scattered ears of grain left behind in the fields. It was most often women, widows, and children who walked the stubble after the reapers had passed, bending to pick up the remnants that had been overlooked or dropped. The practice was not free from regulation. Manorial courts enforced limits, with rules about the hours during which gleaning could take place and the number of people allowed into the fields. Disputes appear in surviving court rolls, where villagers were fined for entering too early or for gathering more than the customary allowance. The significance of gleaning can be seen in accounts that describe entire families relying on the practice during bad harvests. A widow might collect just enough barley to supplement her bread supply for the winter, and without it, her household risked hunger. To deny gleaning was to deny survival, yet reeves sometimes faced the decision of whether to enforce dues strictly or allow leniency. These tensions appear in village records across England and France, where complaints were lodged against officials accused of being too harsh or too generous in allowing the poor to collect from the fields. Beyond the stubble, the commons provided other crucial resources. Meadowland that was not enclosed could supply hay for livestock, while open pastures allowed animals to graze without private charge. Rights of pannage were especially important. During autumn, villagers could drive their pigs into the woods to feed on acorns, beech mast, and chestnuts. In years of failed grain harvest, the fattening of swine on forest mast provided one of the few reliable sources of meat and fat for the coming winter. For smallholders, who kept little land of their own, pannage rights meant the difference between having a pig to slaughter and facing an empty larder. The woods and heaths offered more than forage for animals. Custom allowed the collection of firewood, nuts, berries, and sometimes fallen timber. Forest law, first established in England under Norman kings, and later softened by the Charter of the Forest in 1217, defined who could use these resources and under what conditions. While hunting deer remained the privilege of lords, peasants could lawfully gather brushwood and graze animals in certain areas. Violations were punishable, but so were infringements by lords who attempted to enclose or deny access where custom had long recognized rights. Records from the 13th century describe villagers successfully contesting such enclosures, reminding lords that community survival rested on these shared resources. In practice, the boundaries of common rights were often tested. A villager accused of cutting green wood instead of fallen branches might be summoned before the court, or fined for driving too many pigs into the forest mast. Yet enforcement was uneven, and in times of hardship, officials often tolerated infringements that would otherwise have been punished. These gray areas allowed desperate families to stretch their means further than official custom strictly permitted. The importance of these rights becomes clearer when set against the weight of rents, tithes, and labor services. A household already stripped of a tenth of its grain for the parish, and a significant share for its lord, relied heavily on commons to fill the gap. Without gleaning, forest pannage, or meadow access, the narrow line between sufficiency and hunger would quickly collapse. Community survival depended as much on these informal rights as on the carefully plowed strips of the fields. Records of disputes over gleaning, fines for excess firewood, and quarrels about pigs and the mast reveal how fragile this balance was. In harsh years, the law of leftovers often became the true law of survival. Yet even these rights could not always suffice, forcing communities to look farther afield, to rivers, coasts, and distant markets for relief. In the medieval world, salvation sometimes came from the sea. When fields failed or grain ran thin, communities turned to fish abundant, versatile, and above all, preservable. The Church's strict calendar of fast days, which forbade meat on more than 100 days of the year, reinforced fish as a staple of diet and devotion. Yet fresh fish was fleeting, its flesh quick to spoil, and so the medieval diet leaned heavily on salted and dried varieties, transported across astonishing distances to feed both peasants and princes. Salt was the key. Without it, herring, cod, and other fish would not last more than a day inland. With it, barrels of preserved fish could travel from the Baltic, North Sea, or Atlantic coasts to markets hundreds of miles from shore. Great beds of salt were mined or evaporated in regions like Lüneburg in Germany, the Bay of Bournemouth in France, and the salt pans of Portugal. The cost of this mineral was immense. Entire trade networks were shaped by its extraction and distribution. In England, records from the 13th century show that barrels of salt could account for half the cost of shipping fish to inland towns. The herring trade stands as the clearest example of this maritime lifeline. Each autumn, vast shoals gathered in the North and Baltic seas, and fleets of fishing boats set out to catch them. Coastal towns like Yarmouth in England or Scania in Denmark became temporary cities of wood and canvas, filled with merchants, coopers, and salters. Barrels were packed, sealed, and sent by river, road, and ship to inland markets. Contemporary chronicles note that in some years, the number of barrels leaving Yarmouth reached into the tens of thousands. The success or failure of this migration was felt far from the coast. If the herring failed, fast days turned leaner and the poor went hungry. Nor was herring the only fish on which survival rested. Stockfish air-dried cod, particularly from the waters around Norway and Iceland, formed another critical resource. Its hard, stiff slabs could last for months, even years, if kept dry. And though it required long soaking and pounding before it was edible, it provided reliable protein when local food failed. Hanseatic merchants carried this trade across the North Sea and deep into Central Europe, their cogs laden with fish destined for monasteries, castles, and towns far from the coast. The trade was so profitable that treaties and wars were fought to control it, for whoever held the roots held the power of sustenance. For inland villages, fish represented both a supplement and a connection to wider networks of survival. Market records show peasants buying small quantities of salted herring or eels, stretching them across thin stews. Monastic houses, bound by even stricter dietary rules, purchased enormous amounts, sometimes accounting for the majority of their yearly expenses. At Westminster Abbey in the early 14th century, rolls record the delivery of barrels of herring in Lent, their arrival carefully tallied alongside bread and ale. Salted fish also carried risks. Spoiled barrels, either from poor curing or mishandling in transport, could sicken entire households. Chronicles from famine years tell of desperate people consuming rotted fish or brine-saturated meat, sometimes with fatal results. Yet the demand never faltered, for without preserved fish, the calendar of fasts could not be observed, nor could the gap between one harvest and the next be bridged. The infrastructure of this trade reveals its scale. Roads were measured by the passage of carts laden with barrels, rivers by barges heavy with fish. In some towns, fishmongers formed guilds that regulated weights, measures, and prices, ensuring that supplies, though costly, remained steady. Disputes over rights to fisheries or markets were frequent. In 1281, records from Yarmouth show royal officials intervening in quarrels between local fishermen and foreign merchants, for the herring trade was too vital to be left unchecked. Thus, salt and sea bound together distant regions in a shared economy of survival. A peasant in Huntingdonshire, far from any shore, might live through a harsh Lent on herring caught off Denmark and salted with crystals from Lüneburg. A monk in Burgundy might eat cod dried on Icelandic racks. In famine years, these networks determined who starved and who endured. Salted fish was more than food. It was a bulwark against hunger, sustained by winds, tides, and trade. Yet even these maritime lifelines faltered when scarcity deepened, pushing people back to fragile systems of credit and obligation. When crops failed and barns stood thin, the forest offered another kind of harvest. Medieval villagers looked to the woodland not only for timber and fuel, but also for food, both cultivated and wild. At the heart of this forest economy stood the pig, the most adaptable of domestic animals, whose ability to forage freely in woods turned acorns, beech mast, and roots into precious flesh. The seasonal rite of pannage, allowing swine to feed in the Lord's forest, was one of the most valued privileges of the peasantry, and its loss could mean a winter without meat. Pigs thrived where cattle or sheep could not. Unlike oxen, they required no pasture land, and unlike sheep, they demanded no open field space. Once loosed into the woods, swine rooted beneath oaks and beeches, fattening in the autumn months. By Martinmas in November, they were often slaughtered, their meat salted or smoked to last through the winter. This made pannage not only a seasonal routine, but a critical step in the survival cycle. Manorial records from the 13th century show careful tallies of pigs turned into the woods, with villagers paying fees per head to exercise their rights. The rights themselves varied. Some villages held customary access to royal forests or local lords' woods, while others faced restrictions that grew tighter over time. The expansion of forest law, particularly under the Norman kings in England, turned what had once been common woodland into protected hunting preserves. To gather acorns without license or to drive swine without paying pannage fees became offenses punishable by fines, and in severe cases, by harsher penalties. Yet despite these restrictions, villagers often pressed their luck, for the fattening of swine might spell the difference between a winter of meat or one of gruel. The forest larder extended beyond pigs. Rabbits, hares, and birds were hunted or snared, though game laws often reserved larger quarry, deer, and boar, for the nobility. Fines for poaching appear frequently in forest rolls, but such records also show that the temptation to snare a rabbit or fell a deer was difficult to resist in times of scarcity. More humble, yet equally vital, were the wild foods gathered freely: berries, nuts, mushrooms, and herbs that grew in abundance. Women and children often carried the knowledge of these harvests, knowing where hazelnuts clustered or where medicinal plants could be found beneath the shade of beeches. Fish ponds, streams, and marshes added to this hidden economy. Rights to collect eels, to set traps for pike, or to gather reeds for fuel and thatch often appear in manorial charters. Eels in particular were a staple. Some abbeys measured their income in thousands of eels rendered annually by tenants. These creatures, easily trapped and preserved, offered protein when livestock was scarce. The risk of over-reliance on the forest was clear, however. A poor mast year, when oaks dropped few acorns, left pigs lean and households deprived. Heavy rains could ruin mushroom harvests or flood rivers, spoiling fish traps. Even when nature was generous, human law often intervened. The expansion of aristocratic hunting culture restricted access, and as lords sought to guard their preserves, villagers found themselves squeezed from lands that had once served as communal lifelines. Conflicts were inevitable. Court records tell of peasants fined for gathering fallen branches without leave, or for grazing swine beyond permitted numbers. Yet they also reveal the persistence of customary practice, the insistence that rights to forage, gather, and fatten swine were as ancient as the woods themselves. In many regions, resistance took the form of quiet defiance. An extra pig slipped into the mast, a concealed snare in a thicket, a hidden basket of gathered nuts. Survival often depended on this blend of legality and quiet trespass. The forest larder, with its pigs, forage, and wild foods, thus stood as both refuge and battleground. It was refuge in that it offered nourishment when fields faltered. It was battleground in that access was contested, negotiated, and sometimes stolen. In the balance of mast and law, villagers found either sustenance or punishment. The autumn drive of pigs into oak woods, the gathering of nuts and berries, the setting of fish traps, all these were small acts of survival in a landscape where every calorie counted. When barns were bare, the forest was the last storehouse, its bounty gathered under the canopy of oak and ash. When famine deepened and even the gleanings of the fields or the mast of the forest failed, medieval households turned to what might otherwise have been inedible. The line between food and non-food blurred, as desperation forced people to transform bark, roots, weeds, and acorns into something that could be swallowed. These substitutions carried little nourishment, sometimes none at all, yet they filled bellies and staved off hunger long enough to see another day. They also left behind a record of ingenuity and suffering preserved in court cases, chronicles, and manorial accounts. One of the most striking substitutes was bread made with tree bark. Thin inner layers, stripped from birch or other trees, could be dried, ground, and mixed with a little flour. In parts of Scandinavia, this practice lingered into the early modern period, but its medieval origins are clear. Bark bread was coarse, bitter, and hard to digest, but it produced loaves that could bulk out dwindling supplies of grain. The process itself was laborious, requiring stripping, drying, pounding, and sieving, and the result was often more symbolic than sustaining. Still, in years when no other option remained, bark bread appeared in records as both a survival food and a sign of extreme want. Acorns provided another source of desperate sustenance. Normally avoided because of their bitter tannins, they could be made edible by leaching. Villagers boiled and soaked them in repeated changes of water, sometimes for days, until the bitterness lessened. The softened acorns were then dried and ground into meal that could be mixed with barley or oats. Chronicles from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 note that people turned increasingly to acorns, sometimes consuming them without proper preparation, leading to stomach sickness or worse. In better prepared cases, acorn meal stretched flour into a larger batch of bread or porridge, thin in nutrition, but filling enough to quiet hunger. Roots and weeds were also boiled into stews or pottages. Nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves, and dock appeared in medieval foodways during springtime hunger, known as the lean months before the new harvest ripened. Normally gathered as additions to the diet, they became staples when no grain remained. Chroniclers remarked on people boiling whatever plants they could find, some of which carried little food value and could even be harmful if consumed in quantity. Court rolls occasionally mention disputes over rights to gather roots in meadows or by riverbanks, reflecting how even weeds could become contested property when hunger pressed hard. Another grim substitute was the consumption of bran and chaff. Millers, who collected these byproducts of grain processing, sometimes sold them back to the desperate poor. Bran mixed with a little flour could be baked into flatbreads, coarse and difficult to chew, while chaff was sometimes boiled with roots to produce a thin gruel. Archaeological analysis of human remains from famine cemeteries shows evidence of malnutrition and digestive distress, signs of diets based on these indigestible fillers. Records from manorial courts shed further light on the reliance on substitutes. In one case from Essex during the early 14th century, villagers accused a neighbor of stealing a sack of dried roots from a barn, a theft treated seriously despite the low value, because such foods were vital when nothing else remained. Chroniclers too noted the shift, the appearance of acorns in markets, the trade in bark meal, and the desperate reliance on wild plants. These traces suggest that substitutes were not marginal, but central to the story of how medieval people endured famine. The sensory aspect of these foods also mattered. Bark bread was gritty. Acorn meal retained a faint bitterness even after leaching, and boiled weeds gave off strong odors. Contemporary descriptions speak of the repulsion many felt while eating them, but also of the necessity that drove people past disgust. Hunger reshaped perception. What had once been unthinkable became daily sustenance. For children growing up in famine years, These foods might have been their earliest memory of taste. The use of substitutes revealed the fragile line between survival and collapse. Villagers did not passively await aid. They turned bark, acorns, and roots into something edible. These harsh measures rarely prevented deaths, yet they bought time. Every bitter loaf or boiled root meant another day endured, another chance that the next harvest might finally arrive. Preservation stood at the heart of medieval survival, for the harvest could not simply be eaten as it came from the field. Grain, meat, and drink had to last through long winters and unpredictable shortages, and so households invested time and labor into transforming perishable food into stores that might carry them through the lean months. Without these methods, even a bountiful harvest risked becoming useless by spring. Smoking was among the oldest and most common practices. Huts or sheds were built with racks where meat and fish hung above slow-burning fires of oak or beech. The smoke dried and infused the flesh, extending its life and imparting a distinct taste. Household accounts from 15th century Norfolk list wood, gathered specifically for smokehouses, showing how integral this work was to the yearly cycle. A family with no smokehouse might rent space in a neighbor's, or rely on lords or monasteries who maintained larger facilities. Salted meat was common, but smoked meat could last months longer if well kept, and in many regions the smell of curing smoke became as familiar in autumn as the reek of the harvest stubble. Salt itself was indispensable. It preserved meat, fish, and even some vegetables, though at significant cost. Salt pans along the English coast, and in regions like the Bay of Biscay supplied inland markets carried by cart and river. Records show peasants purchasing salt at fairs, or receiving it as part of wages. In coastal towns, saltfish became a staple, with herring, cod, and eels preserved for winter use or for sale inland. The Hanseatic League carried salted fish deep into Europe, feeding towns hundreds of miles from the sea. Without salt, whole categories of food could not have been stored at all. Drying offered another solution. Apples, pears, and plums were sliced and laid in the sun or over low heat, producing dried fruits that could sweeten winter pottages or serve as rare treats in otherwise monotonous diets. Herbs were dried for flavor and medicine, while beans and peas were laid out in lofts until the pods crackled. Archaeological finds of dried seeds and pits in medieval middens confirm how common such practices were, even in modest households. Brewing provided not just preservation but transformation. Grain could be turned into ale, a drink that carried calories, provided safe hydration, and stored more reliably than plain water. Small beer, weak in alcohol, was consumed daily by men, women, and children alike. Brewing was often the responsibility of women within the household, though larger-scale production by alewives and abbeys is well documented. Ale had to be brewed regularly, as it did not keep long, but the process meant that grain could be consumed in liquid form, extending its usefulness and ensuring that even poor households had access to a steady source of nutrition. Stone, too, played its part. Granaries and barns were sometimes built of stone to better resist damp and pests, especially in wealthier estates or monastic complexes. Stone jars, crocks, and cellars helped in storing butter, cheese, and preserved meats, shielding them from rot and vermin. In monastic records, entries note expenditures on stone containers for pickled or salted goods, underscoring how physical infrastructure mattered as much as the preservation process itself. Despite all these measures, spoilage was never far away. A single damp week could ruin a stack of drying beans, and improperly sealed barrels of salted fish might rot before midwinter. Court rolls include disputes over spoiled ale or accusations of dishonest brewers who watered down their product, a crime that threatened both health and survival. Preservation was therefore not only a matter of craft, but of vigilance, for every stage of storing food carried risk. The rhythm of preservation followed the seasons closely. Autumn brought slaughtering, salting, and smoking. Summer saw drying of fruits and herbs, and brewing continued year-round in cycles that mirrored the availability of grain. Families worked not only for immediate consumption, but for a larder that had to last until the next llamas. In those months when the fields gave little, it was the smokehouse, the barrel, and the ale vat that kept hunger at bay. In the medieval countryside, monasteries stood out not only as centers of prayer and learning, but also as key nodes in the struggle against hunger. Their barns, cellars, and almonries functioned as reservoirs of food that could, at least in principle, be tapped for the poor in times of scarcity. The Church's obligation to charity was no abstract doctrine. It was written into daily routines of distribution, carefully recorded in account rolls, and visible in the lines of beggars who gathered at abbey gates. The almonry was the most direct channel. Each monastery appointed an almoner, responsible for distributing bread, ale, and sometimes meat or cheese to those who sought aid. In prosperous houses such as the great Benedictine Abbey at Bury St. Edmunds, dozens of loaves might be handed out each day. Records from the 14th century list quantities of grain purchased specifically for alms, indicating that feeding the poor was not left to chance, but built into the budget of the house. Even smaller priories maintained some provision, often in the form of pottage or broth distributed after the convent's meals. Charity extended beyond the daily dole. Hospitals attached to monasteries, originally meant for the sick and the traveler, also served as refuges for the hungry. Infirmaries often dispensed simple meals, particularly during harvest failures when numbers swelled. Pilgrims, too, benefited from this network. On routes such as the road to Santiago de Compostela or the path to Canterbury, monasteries offered bread and drink to travelers, blending religious duty with practical relief. For many, pilgrimage itself became a survival tactic, since it guaranteed some access to food. The size and scale of monastic resources gave them a role that no single household could match. Abbeys owned vast tracts of land and collected tithes from dependent villages, meaning their barns often held reserves that surpassed those of local lords. In years of famine, these reserves could be decisive. Chronicle accounts from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 describe monasteries opening their stores, though often under pressure from local authorities or the crown. The same sources also record resentment when abbots hesitated to distribute too freely, fearing depletion of their own needs. Distribution was rarely without conflict. Monastic officials had to balance their obligations to charity with responsibilities to their tenants, their monks, and sometimes the king's officers. Court records reveal disputes in which villagers accused abbots of withholding grain or selling it at inflated prices. In one case from Yorkshire in 1320, a group of townsmen petitioned against a Cistercian abbey for exporting grain while locals went hungry. The abbey defended its actions by citing obligations to other estates, illustrating the tension between local desperation and institutional priorities. Nevertheless, many monasteries became known for their generosity, at least in relative terms. Monastic chronicles sometimes highlighted the abbey's relief efforts as evidence of piety. At St. Albans, accounts note the provision of bread to hundreds during lean years, with monks themselves reducing their own portions to maintain the dole. These moments of sacrifice reinforce the spiritual image of the monastery as a mediator between divine bounty and human need. Yet the system had limits. Charity could not erase structural shortages. Even a wealthy abbey could not feed every hungry mouth in its region. Some almonries set strict quotas. Only a certain number of loaves each day, only to those who arrived first, only at fixed hours. Others issued tokens or kept lists of regular recipients, leaving newcomers without aid. The result was that while monasteries provided critical lifelines, many still went hungry despite living within sight of towering abbey walls. The material setting of relief was itself symbolic. At the gatehouse, beggars lined up beneath carved stone saints, waiting for bread handed through narrow windows. In the almonry hall, lines of the poor received loaves while monks recited prayers. These spaces reinforced the connection between spiritual obligation and physical sustenance. For the recipient, however, the experience was more immediate: a crust of bread, a ladle of broth, and the knowledge of survival for one more day. Monastic relief was thus both practical and emblematic. It bound together theology, institutional power, and the rhythms of hunger. The abbey's barns and almonries provided real calories that saved lives, but they also highlighted the dependency of the poor on structures beyond their control. In the fragile balance of medieval survival, Monasteries offered one of the few organized networks of aid, even if imperfect and contested. In the medieval world, the market square was as essential to survival as the open field. It was here, amid the cries of traders and the tolling of the town bell, that surplus grain, salted fish, or barrels of ale changed hands. For villagers whose harvests had failed, or for townspeople who had no fields of their own, the market provided access to food that might otherwise have been out of reach. The rhythms of life were tied not only to the seasons of sowing and reaping, but also to the weekly or seasonal market days, when supply and demand collided in plain view. Merchants stood at the center of this exchange. Unlike peasants who consumed what they grew, merchants lived from buying and selling. They transported food across regions, linking coastal fisheries to inland towns, or carrying grain from fertile valleys into cities where demand was constant. In prosperous years, their wagons and ships expanded diets, offering herrings from the North Sea or wine from Gascony. In lean years, however, merchants often became targets of resentment, accused of hoarding or profiteering while common folk starved. Authorities attempted to regulate this delicate balance through price laws. From the 13th century, many towns enforced maximum prices on bread and ale, designed to ensure that staples remained affordable. The assize of bread and ale, common in England, tied the price of a loaf directly to the cost of grain. Bakers caught selling underweight bread or charging too much faced public humiliation, fines, or even the pillory. These regulations reflected a recognition that hunger threatened not only bodies, but also public order. A riot could erupt more quickly over bread prices than over almost any other grievance. Markets were also arenas of inspection. Weights and measures were checked by officials to prevent fraud, and stalls were monitored for quality. A sack of grain that contained stones or adulterated flour was not merely dishonest, it was an attack on survival. Punishments for such offenses were harsh, not only to deter cheating, but to reassure anxious populations that someone watched over fairness. In this way, regulation itself became part of the fragile social contract. Despite such controls, shortages pushed prices upward. Chroniclers during the Great Famine of 1315-1317 recorded loaves selling for triple their normal price, with some towns seeing grain vanish entirely from stalls. In desperation, civic leaders sometimes seized supplies from merchants, rationing them to households at controlled prices. These measures were unevenly enforced, and they sparked bitter disputes. Merchants argued that such seizures destroyed the very networks of trade that might bring relief. Villagers and townspeople countered that without intervention, only the wealthy could eat. Long-distance trade magnified these tensions. Grain could be imported from more fertile regions, but transport costs and tolls made it expensive. Rivers and coastal shipping routes were vital arteries, but storms or war could sever them overnight. In 1316, ships laden with grain bound for London were driven back by winds, leaving the city hungry. In Flanders, blockades disrupted supplies of herring, undermining both diet and economy. These disruptions revealed how fragile reliance on trade could be when every link of the chain was threatened by weather, politics, or conflict. Merchants themselves occupied a precarious place in medieval society. They were necessary, for no community was entirely self-sufficient, yet they were often distrusted. Stereotypes of the greedy trader appear in sermons and literature, reflecting fears that profit was being made from misery. Guilds sought to defend reputations by policing members and ensuring fair dealing, but suspicion lingered. During famines, merchants were sometimes attacked outright, their carts looted or ships stormed by angry crowds. Still, trade also saved lives. When local harvests failed, imported grain could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. Market networks redistributed food, even if imperfectly. A villager might sell a pig at one stall and buy barley at another, securing nourishment that the manor alone could not provide. The market was therefore both risk and salvation, a stage where hunger and relief played out simultaneously. Survival ultimately depended on the integrity of markets, the enforcement of price laws, and the uncertain choices of merchants. The square, with its stalls of grain and fish, clerks weighing loaves, and guards enforcing order, was never merely a place of commerce. It was the front line of famine, where wealth and desperation collided. In the medieval village, survival did not rest solely upon harvests and barns. It also depended on the invisible threads of credit and obligation that bound communities together. Grain, meat, and even labor could be borrowed against future repayment. And in the lean months before the next harvest, these exchanges often determined who endured and who went hungry. The pledging of goods or land for food was rarely a matter of choice. It was the last resort of households standing at the brink of famine. By the 13th century, manorial court rolls record peasants pledging tools, livestock, or even strips of land to secure grain from their lords. A plow might be surrendered temporarily in return for bushels of rye, with the hope that repayment after harvest would restore it. Failure to repay, however, meant forfeiture, and with it the permanent weakening of a family's ability to farm. In this way, the cycles of famine were not only biological but also economic, stripping peasants of resources that had taken generations to build. Church institutions also entered this world of credit. Monasteries and parish clergy extended grain or coin to villagers in times of want, recording the transactions in account rolls. These loans were sometimes framed as charity, but repayment was still expected, often with hidden interest in the form of fees or additional labor obligations. To fall into debt with the church risked not only material loss, but also public shame, for defaulters were frequently named before the congregation. Survival bought on borrowed grain carried both financial and spiritual weight. Jewish moneylenders likewise played a role in this fragile economy of famine. In towns such as Lincoln, York, and Cologne, records show Christians pawning goods or pledging future payments in exchange for coin that could purchase food at market. Though restrictions on usury shaped these exchanges, the reality was that in moments of crisis, many turned to those able to provide quick credit, yet such debts could be ruinous. Royal records from England list peasants who defaulted on food loans, losing tools or strips of land their families had held for generations. Desperation sometimes fueled resentment, and outbreaks of violence against Jewish communities were tragically linked to such tensions. The tally stick illustrates how deeply borrowing penetrated medieval life. These wooden rods, notched to mark sums owed, circulated between peasants, lords, and merchants. A villager borrowing a measure of wheat might see the notches cut before witnesses, half of the stick retained by the creditor, half by the debtor. Each mark stood as a record of survival on borrowed time. When repayment could not be made, tally sticks were presented in court, transforming hunger into a legal dispute. In towns, credit networks were more complex. Bakers extended loaves on trust to customers expected to pay later, and fishmongers sold salted herring with the understanding that repayment would come at the next wage. Authorities, however, monitored these practices, fearing that too much unpaid debt could destabilize food supply. Ordinances from London in the late 13th century restricted how far bakers could extend credit, recognizing that charity stretched too far could collapse into insolvency. The cost of borrowing during famine was often exorbitant. Grain prices already spiked in scarcity, and those who lent demanded repayment at inflated rates. To borrow a bushel of rye in March might mean returning 2 or 3 after harvest. These terms kept families alive, but locked them into cycles of dependence. Chroniclers noted peasants mortgaging everything from tools to clothing, until some were forced to sell their land and descend into the ranks of landless laborers. Yet, without these networks of credit and pledges, famine would have claimed even more lives. Borrowed food allowed villages to bridge the perilous months between sowing and reaping. Pawns and loans provided temporary lifelines, even if they exacted heavy tolls in the long run. For every story of a peasant stripped of land through debt, another tells of a household that endured famine because a neighbor extended grain or a monastery opened its granary. The story of credit in the medieval world is therefore one of ambivalence. It sustained, but it also dispossessed. It offered survival, but it entrenched inequality. In the act of carving a notch on a tally stick or handing over a pledged tool, villagers wagered their futures against the uncertain promise of the next harvest. For many, the gamble was unavoidable. To refuse borrowing meant immediate hunger. To accept it meant survival now, at the price of tomorrow. In the medieval countryside, the failure of crops left families with few options but to leave their homes behind. Survival depended not only on grain grown in their own strips, but also on wages or alms that could be earned elsewhere. Movement, whether temporary or permanent, became a crucial strategy for those who could not withstand famine in place. Seasonal labor, pilgrimage, and even mass flight from ruined villages shaped the landscape of medieval survival. Seasonal labor was the most common form of mobility. During harvest time, wealthier estates required additional hands, and men and women without sufficient land of their own traveled to neighboring manors or towns to sell their work. Court rolls from the 14th century record groups of laborers moving between parishes at harvest, seeking wages in coin or payment in kind, often measured in bread, ale, or a share of grain. For poorer peasants, this employment could mean the difference between starvation and endurance through the winter. Yet the availability of work was unreliable, and in years of famine, the number of desperate seekers far exceeded the number of places available. Urban centers also drew migrants during shortages. A villager might leave home after the harvest failed, joining the flow of people into towns such as London, Paris, or Cologne. There, the hope was to secure employment in trades, markets, or as servants in wealthier households. Borough court records mention rural migrants seeking apprenticeships or casual labor in exchange for food. Yet urban life carried new risks. Crowded tenements spread disease. Food prices could soar even higher than in the countryside, and authorities sometimes expelled those without work, fearing unrest. Pilgrimage offered another path of survival, both spiritual and practical. Shrines such as Canterbury or Santiago de Compostela became destinations for those who hoped to receive alms along the road. Pilgrims were entitled to hospitality at monasteries and hospitals, where bread, pottage, and ale were distributed as part of charity. In famine years, some adopted the guise of pilgrimage less for devotion than for sustenance. Chroniclers noted suspicions among clergy that many pilgrims were in fact refugees from hunger, yet the movement was tolerated because it conformed to religious practice and eased pressure on home communities. Not all journeys were sanctioned. In times of severe scarcity, whole villages could be abandoned as families set out in search of food. During the Great Famine of 1315-1317, chroniclers in Flanders and northern France described roads filled with beggars and displaced people, carrying children on carts or leading their livestock in ragged columns. Manorial records in parts of England note deserted holdings, their tenants gone without permission. Such flight was technically illegal for medieval law-bound peasants to their lords and their land, but hunger often outweighed obligation. Lords complained of labor shortages, while villages with sufficient stores saw migrants as a burden rather than a relief. The risks of travel were considerable. Roads exposed migrants to theft and violence, while arrivals in unfamiliar parishes could be refused entry at the church door or denied access to common land. In towns, newcomers were sometimes subjected to special taxes or confined to certain quarters. Women and children were particularly vulnerable, with court records noting cases of abandonment or exploitation. Despite these dangers, remaining in a starving village could prove worse. Mobility was not always permanent. Some laborers traveled only for the harvest, returning home once wages had been earned. Others left with the intention of returning after conditions improved, while a few never came back, their lands passing into the hands of neighbors or lords. Patterns of departure and return reshaped communities, leaving some diminished while others swelled temporarily with outsiders. The church attempted to mediate the disruptions caused by flight. Bishops ordered monasteries and parishes to provide alms to travelers in times of scarcity, while statutes sought to regulate begging or restrict vagrancy. Royal edicts in England urged towns to tolerate migrants, but also authorized punishment for theft and disorder. These measures reflected the uneasy balance between compassion and fear that mobility created. For many medieval people, leaving home was a gamble taken under duress. Whether as hired hands at harvest, pilgrims on the road to shrines, or refugees abandoning ruined villages, they moved not in pursuit of opportunity, but in search of survival. When famine struck medieval Europe, hunger was not only a private trial borne within households, it spilled into the streets, markets, and churchyards, where scarcity turned desperation into open conflict. Theft, riots, and royal intervention became familiar features of crisis years, revealing how thin the line was between order and chaos when bread ran short. Theft was often the first recourse of the desperate. Court rolls from the 13th and 14th centuries show sharp increases in prosecutions for stealing food during famine years. Chickens, loaves of bread, sacks of barley, and even turnips pulled from fields became the objects of petty theft. In England, manorial courts record women caught with stolen sheaves of grain, children seizing apples from orchards, and laborers accused of taking handfuls of seed from barns. Though punishments varied, from fines and public shaming to the stocks or whipping, the persistence of such thefts underlines that hunger pressed people into risks they might never have otherwise considered. Yet when scarcity deepened, isolated theft gave way to collective disorder. Riots erupted most often in marketplaces, where the confrontation between hungry buyers and reluctant sellers was unavoidable. Chroniclers describe how towns such as Bruges, Ghent, and London witnessed crowds overturning stalls, seizing grain, or demanding that merchants sell at just prices. In Paris, during the famine of 1316, bread riots broke out as people accused bakers of hoarding flour and inflating prices. The crowd's anger often mixed moral outrage with desperation, the sense that some profited from misery while others starved. Markets became theaters of negotiation as well as violence. Authorities tried to calm crowds by regulating prices, announcing maximums for loaves or measures of grain. Sheriffs, bailiffs, and constables patrolled stalls, attempting to enforce these laws while preventing riots from flaring. But enforcement was inconsistent, and in times of extreme scarcity, even strict decrees could not conjure grain that simply did not exist. The attempt to stabilize supply often revealed the limits of royal or civic power, particularly in towns dependent on imported food. The crown played a visible role in these crises. Kings issued proclamations against hoarding, dispatched officials to requisition grain, and sometimes authorized forced sales. During the Great Famine in England, royal officers were ordered to inspect mills, granaries, and bakeries, ensuring that food was being sold fairly. Similar interventions occurred in France, where Philip V ordered supplies redirected to Paris when shortages threatened unrest. These measures were intended both to relieve hunger and to safeguard political stability, for rulers knew that famine could erode loyalty and spark rebellion. Still, royal intervention was not always welcomed. Grain seizures angered merchants who had purchased supplies at great cost, and forced price controls could bankrupt bakers or millers caught between regulation and reality. In some cases, communities resisted royal orders, hiding grain or turning against officials. A balance had to be struck between visible action to reassure the hungry and caution not to alienate those whose trade was essential to recovery. Punishment for food riots could be severe. Civic records from Bruges in the 1322 detail executions of those accused of inciting crowds, while English justices sometimes imposed corporal penalties on rioters to discourage further disorder. Yet the harshness of response varied with circumstance. When scarcity was extreme, authorities sometimes refrained from full repression, fearing that brutal punishments would inflame rather than pacify a starving populace. Beyond the official record, famine riots reveal a deeper truth. Communities negotiated survival not only through charity, trade, or migration, but also through conflict. Markets were not neutral spaces of exchange, but battlegrounds where the poor contested access to food and the wealthy defended their stores. Chroniclers often portrayed rioters as unruly mobs, yet the consistency with which crowds demanded fair weights, just prices, or the release of hoarded grain suggests a moral economy at work. People believed food was a right in times of need, and they acted upon that conviction. The image of markets filled with overturned stalls, of loaves snatched from bakers' carts, or of constables trying to restore order, captures the fragile balance of medieval survival. Hunger tested both community bonds and royal authority. For villagers who risked theft, for crowds who rioted in squares, and for kings who sought to calm them, The market in famine years was not merely a place of trade. It was the stage upon which life, law, and loyalty collided under the shadow of starvation. In times of famine, survival often rested not on lords, kings, or markets, but on the ingenuity exercised within the home. At the heart of this domestic economy stood women, whose daily labor of cooking, brewing, and bartering determined whether households endured hunger or succumbed to it. Their work, scattered through manorial accounts, court rolls, and household guides, reveals how endurance depended as much on resourcefulness at the hearth as on the harvest in the fields. Brewing was among the most vital tasks. Ale was not merely a drink but a staple of the medieval diet, providing calories and safer hydration than much of the water supply. Women brewed ale in small batches, adjusting recipes depending on what grain could be spared. In famine years, barley or oats might be stretched with peas or beans, producing weaker brews, but conserving bread flour. Records from English towns show that many women, known as alewives, sold their brews to neighbors, turning brewing into both sustenance and livelihood. Regulation of ale prices during shortages reflects how central this household task was to communal survival. Barter formed another lifeline. Women carried surplus bread, cheese, or spun wool to markets, exchanging them for foods their households lacked. A pair of eggs might be swapped for barley, or cloth for beans. These modest exchanges redistributed resources when coin was scarce, extending the reach of households beyond their own strips. In famine years, whispered bargains at the church door or over market stalls often secured food that would otherwise never have been available. Household management under scarcity required constant adaptation. Recipes shifted as ingredients dwindled. Pottages, thick soups of grain and vegetables, were stretched with water to feed more mouths. Scraps of meat, bones, or foraged greens were boiled for every possible measure of nourishment. Chronicles rarely note such substitutions, yet account books from monasteries and noble estates reveal similar practices on a larger scale. For peasant households, these adjustments were the daily arithmetic of survival, carried out by women who stretched stores with ingenuity. Pawn and pledge records reveal that women often managed decisions over household goods during famine. Pots, cloaks, or bedding might be offered as collateral for food loans. Such pledges show women's role as stewards of household assets, weighing what could be risked for immediate sustenance. Forfeiture meant the permanent loss of essentials, yet these decisions often spelled the difference between survival and collapse. Women also stood at the center of neighborhood charity. Loaves were shared, labor exchanged, and obligations recorded informally in church courts, which occasionally heard disputes when promises of food went undelivered. Behind these quarrels lay the reality that famine made households dependent on small, reciprocal acts of generosity, usually initiated by women maintaining fragile community ties. In towns, women's ingenuity found different outlets. Many became vendors of prepared foods, hot pottages, pies, or baked goods, sold to laborers without the means to cook. In famine years, such trades grew essential, offering sustenance at prices lower than full measures of grain. Ordinances regulating these vendors show how widespread and vital their presence was, particularly in poorer districts. Religion also intersected with women's food roles. The obligation to provide for fasts, feasts, or pilgrim hospitality often fell to women, who stretched stores to satisfy both spiritual and material demands. When monasteries or hospitals distributed alms, it was usually women who queued at their doors, carrying loaves or grain home to feed their families. These records underline their position as household managers of food security. The quiet labor of brewing, bartering, cooking, and managing was no guarantee against famine, but it was the first and most enduring defense. Women transformed the little that was available into meals, turned scraps into exchanges, and bore the weight of pledges that secured temporary reprieve. Their work rarely entered chronicles written by clerics or officials, yet it underpinned survival as surely as the harvest itself. The hearth, humble though it was, became a place of resilience in times of want. Here, loaves were stretched, ale brewed from whatever grain could be spared, and scraps bartered into sustenance. In the shadow of famine, women's work offered not triumph but endurance, a fragile, daily defiance of hunger, carried out with patience, skill, and quiet strength. The Great Famine did not descend in a single blow, but crept forward year after year, breaking down the foundations of medieval life with a persistence that felt almost deliberate. Between 1315 and 1317, Northern Europe endured rains, rot, and hunger on a scale rarely seen before. For the people who lived through it, survival meant navigating 3 relentless seasons of scarcity, in which each year brought new trials and compounded the last. The opening act came in the spring of 1315. May and June were marked by rain so constant that fields lay drowned before they could yield anything. Newly sown seed rotted in the soil, hay for winter fodder could not be dried, and pastures became bogs that weakened livestock. Cattle and sheep sickened, their hooves softened by mud, their bellies empty from spoiled feed. Farmers, accustomed to occasional poor weather, soon realized this was no ordinary year. By late summer, it was clear that barns would stand half empty. Prices of wheat, rye, and barley rose quickly in market towns. Bread became smaller, weaker, and scarcer. Chroniclers described roads filled with beggars before the year was out, as the hunger season arrived months ahead of schedule. If 1315 had been grim, 1316 proved catastrophic. Once again, the rains returned, heavier than before. Rivers swelled, villages flooded, and attempts at cultivation ended in failure. For a second year, grain yields collapsed, leaving no reserves to cushion the blow. Chroniclers across Flanders, northern France, and England spoke of starvation spreading like a contagion. Parish registers reveal sharp rises in burials, while monastic accounts admitted that almonries could no longer meet the demand for bread and pottage. In towns, food riots erupted. In London, bakers were threatened for inflating prices, while in Ypres and Ghent, grain shipments were intercepted by angry crowds. Even the crown could not enforce stability. Edward II's price controls failed because laws could not conjure grain where none existed. The desperation of 1,316 bread stories that shocked later generations. Rumors of people eating horses, dogs, and even the flesh of the dead circulated through chronicles. Whether exaggerated or not, they reveal the terror of a society stretched to its limits. Theft rose sharply, and local courts filled with cases of grain stolen from fields, barns, or markets. Villages were sometimes abandoned outright, as families left in search of food. Lords complained of deserted holdings and dwindling labor services, but hunger drove people farther than loyalty to land or lord could restrain. By 1317, a faint shift occurred. The rains eased, though the earth had been battered beyond quick recovery. Much seed grain had been eaten out of desperation, leaving little to sow, and many draft animals had died, crippling plow teams. As a result, even with better weather, the harvest was modest and late. Still, compared to 1316, mortality began to slow, suggesting that communities had found ways to stretch what remained or that fewer mouths remained alive to feed. Survival was still uncertain, but the relentless spiral of decline showed signs of halting. The aftermath lingered long after the skies cleared. Families who had pawned tools, pledged land, or sold livestock to endure the famine often found themselves permanently dispossessed. A plow lost in 1316 might never be redeemed, leaving a family unable to cultivate, even when fields became fertile again. Monasteries and lords consolidated property as desperate tenants forfeited holdings. In some parishes, population levels never returned to their former strength, leaving open fields untilled for years. The famine thus reshaped the social as well as the physical landscape, locking many into deeper poverty. For contemporaries, these years were interpreted as divine punishment. Chroniclers wrote of a world out of joint, where sun and season no longer obeyed their rightful order. Yet the famine was not only the work of the heavens, it revealed the fragility of reliance on grain, the limits of market supply, and the inability of kings or bishops to shield their people. Survival, in the end, depended on fragile strategies: foraging, credit, migration, and charity, each tested to their limits. When later generations spoke of 1,315 to 1,317, they remembered not simply the rains, but the years when bread itself seemed to vanish. For those who lived through it, each day endured was both a victory and a reminder of how thin the boundary lay between life and death.